Yeah, so I am focusing on a rather provocative question. Is nationalism synonymous with racism? And before tackling it, I want to first discuss 3 beliefs that I hold to help you better understand my position, where I'm coming from. First, racism is real, but it isn't what it used to be. In the past, racism was considered the belief that people are superior or inferior to others based on their color. In much of the Western world, especially here in the U.S., it was based on white supremacy, the belief that whites are inherently better than everyone else and should thus rule over and even enslave others, non-whites. And this led to hundreds of years, of course, of some of the worst kinds of cruelties and injustices against non-whites, especially blacks, including slavery, over decades, as well as systematic discrimination in education, housing, voting, employment, criminal justice, and other badly needed social necessities. And although there are far fewer outright racists in our country today, some of these systemic injustices remain to be fully excised from American culture. And this remains my definition of racism, which is why I consider things far better today than they were in the past, but also acknowledge that there remains much work to do in this regard. There are indications, however, that many on the far right believe that racism has been entirely eradicated from our society and that the protections put into place to improve the lives of blacks and other non-whites and to guarantee their equal treatment in education, employment, housing, voting, and criminal justice are no longer necessary and should be overturned and eliminated. Their argument is that these protections have themselves become mechanisms for discriminating, in this case against whites. And such thinking has led to what, for many of us, are deeply troubling outcomes. In 2023, the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action in college admissions, a policy that had been in place for decades. And just this year, Executive Order 11246, which for the past 60 years had required federal contractors to actively combat race and sex discrimination in hiring, was revoked overnight. DEI programs across the federal government were eliminated by another executive order. And just last month, the Supreme Court gutted Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the very provision enacted in 1965 to ensure black Americans could not be locked out at the ballot box, a decision that has already cleared the way for some states to begin redrawing district maps that deliberately dilute minority voting power. That's decades worth of hard-won protections dismantled in a matter of months, all under the auspice of no longer being necessary since racism is no longer a problem. On the other hand, many on the extreme left seem to believe little to nothing has improved over the decades and are so desperate to prove their point that they find signs of racism where there aren't any, only adding to the dismissive and paranoid ideas of those on the far right. For example, for several years, the businesses in the Finneywood neighborhood near Seattle's Woodland Park Zoo have been decorating their windows with monkeys during the winter holiday seasons as a show of their neighborhood spirit. The displays were quite popular, quite beloved, but in 2020, the neighborhood association hired a new director who told them that the holiday monkeys were a racist trope and had to go. Naturally, this upset a lot of people and created much conflict. Additionally, the association center, built in 1904 as a public school, contained only one small water fountain. So in 2012, they installed a larger fountain that included a bottle filler, but kept the smaller fountain for its historic value and because it was more accessible to smaller children. The new director soon claimed that the separate water fountains brought up imagery of racial segregation. So the association leadership had the smaller one removed, which also created a lot of controversy. Not surprisingly, and according to the Neighborhood Association's own account, within 6 months the new director resigned, having, quote, vocally stated that much of her decision to leave involved structural racism that she endured while working at PNA, and she specifically has mentioned the monkeys, along with other examples in her public statements. And my files contain many such anecdotes, but I will resist the temptation to offer more. From my perspective, however, if monkeys displayed in the context of a neighborhood's connection to its zoo, and 2 water fountains, one for adults and one for small children, as we have in our own religious education wing, accessible to everyone, are what it now means to be racist, then we have come a long way, baby. For this is nothing like the racism I witnessed growing up in the 60s and 70s, let alone what occurred during the many decades before I was born. Just as those on the far right ignore obvious examples of systemic racism, those on the far left are so desperate to find examples of it that they see it in harmless places and project it into the hearts of innocent people. I sometimes joke that those on the far right and those on the far left should get together because they have so much in common. Those on the right wish that we were still living in the 50s, and those on the left think we still are. Second, we are all part of a global community, but do not yet think of ourselves as such, which has led to some of today's worst problems. The age of the internet and mass global communication, along with intercontinental travel, a global economy, a global supply chain, global trade, global medicine and science, global entertainment, international companies and corporations, along with major global challenges like disease, pandemics, and climate change, have all pushed us out of the closed and comforting nest we have for the past 150 years called our nations. Today we are all citizens of a tightly knit world, part of one global community, part of one human family. Our transition to this new reality, however, is incomplete. We are still in its disruptive phase, which has led to lots of fear-based resistance and hostility. And this is further manifested in the recent diminishment of democracies for the first time in 200 years, and to the subsequent rise of authoritarians and tyrants who promise to focus only on the interests of their own nations. Take Brexit and Make America Great Again as examples, as is Russia's aggression against Ukraine and Israel's aggression against almost all of its neighbors. Such resistance to our new reality, however, is ultimately fruitless, resulting only in death and destruction, never productivity, because we cannot move forward together until we see ourselves as one people who are all in this together. It's only then that we'll be able to accept new paradigms about ourselves and our world and begin to erect global systems of governance, engagement, and human welfare to truly address our greatest challenges, like climate change and nuclear disarmament and worldwide human rights. Third, where we are from matters, but it doesn't define us. Until last year, I was of a mind that we should all become purely cosmopolitan in our thinking, citizens of the world, and that we should rid ourselves entirely of our nationalized identities. But then I discovered John Dietrich's 1919 sermon, Nationalism and Internationalism, which has slightly altered my thinking. When we speak of a country as a nation, Dietrich says, we mean a group of persons living within a certain territory who feel at home with one another, who understand one another, who work with one another, who love one another, who feel themselves bound together by a kinship which is felt for no other group of persons in the world. I agree. To recognize that we are part of the global human family and that all people should have equal rights and freedom, as well as a basic quality of life, is vital, but it cannot possibly mean that we must feel for complete strangers what we feel for those closest to us. After all, we live and we love locally. What is important, as Dietrich further points out, is that to love one's country should not mean to hate all others, any more than to love one's home means to despise all others. We must learn that the interests of the whole are greater than the interests of only one part. This does not mean that we should not love the nation in which we belong, he says. It means rather that when there is a clash between the interest of our nation and the world at large, we must recognize the supremacy and the interest of humanity to those of our nation. And this is what I mean by the international mind. Love and loyalty to the nation, but still greater love and loyalty to mankind. Dietrich's perspective offers us the proper balance between caring about the people in our lives while always observing the humanistic ethic that we cannot enjoy our lives if doing so means being inhuman to those we dismiss as outsiders, to those outside our nation, to those outside our family, to those outside our race, outside our religion, outside our political party, and so forth. Today, the lines between nations are more blurred than ever because it is possible for us to develop relationships and friendships with people who live so far away, including in other countries, that we may never meet them in person, yet care very much about them, as much about them as we do any friend. During our first service, I said hi to my friend Stephen Palmer, who watches the early service all the way from Italy. I had to stop and question, have I ever met Stephen in person? I haven't. But he's a very valuable friend and important part of my life. And we've only communicated via Zoom. So the world has gotten smaller. And to reiterate and summarize what I've said so far, racism is real, but it isn't what it used to be. We are all part of a global community, but do not yet think of ourselves as such, which has led to some of today's worst problems. And where we are from matters, but it does not define us. Etymologically speaking, racism obviously is not synonymous with nationalism. They have very different definitions. More importantly, in comparing the two, I do not mean to diminish the realities of racism that still exist in the U.S. and other parts of the world. What I do mean to do is draw some parallels between them by acknowledging the similar horrors and injustices being committed in the name of my country. Nowadays, most people in the U.S. loathe racism and dread being called racist, including those who are racist, which was not always the case. Yet many Americans have no apparent problem disregarding the dignity, the rights, the welfare, and the lives of others when doing so is based on their sense of nationalism, their sense of national identity. For instance, dozens, including many civilians, were killed during the U.S.'s January 3rd military invasion of Venezuela to capture President Nicolas Maduro. Excuse me. The next morning, President Trump, from the comfort of his Mar-a-Lago estate, bragged at what he called a spectacular assault. No nation in the world could achieve what America achieved yesterday. He said, adding that no American service members or equipment was lost. The clear implication here is that such a mission is a success if no Americans get killed, but the lives of Venezuelan citizens are inconsequential, not worth mentioning. And this is more than merely a position of our government. Our national media, reflective of our wider culture, also made much of the first Americans killed the day after Trump's February 28th unprovoked military assault against Iran. 3 U.S. service members were killed and 5 were seriously injured amid the ongoing conflict in Iran, a typical byline read. In the days that followed, the media bombarded us with stories about the lives of those particular Americans killed. And during an annual Memorial Day service at Arlington National Cemetery last week, Trump laid wreaths at the graves of what are now 13 service members who have died in that conflict, which was also big news in the national media. The loss of their lives is indeed tragic. It's tragic partly because they are unnecessary, and they should be honored. But as an American, I'm disturbed by such hypocrisy in light of our more usual and blatant disregard for the lives of those who are not Americans, but are undoubtedly no less human than any American. Moving on. Republicans have been using the issue of abortion as a political wedge issue for decades, and finally got their wish when the partisan Supreme Court overruled Roe v. Wade midway through 2022. The supporters of this decision claim they are pro-life, so much so that they even want to save unborn lives. But where was their outrage, their tears, their appeals to their legislators, to the Supreme Court, when the U.S. blew up the Sajara Tayyiba Elementary School to smithereens on February 28th of this year, killing over 100 school children and dozens of others? Were their lives not as sacred as an unborn American fetus? Are their lives not worth our outrage, our tears, our pleas, because the school happened to be in Iran instead of the U.S.? We commemorate dates like September 11th when the World Trade Center was attacked, or December 7th when Pearl Harbor was struck, but how many of us will long remember February 28th when Americans bombed and laid waste to a school full of Iranian children? Sadly, it's not just the lives of those outside our nation that some of us could care less about. Those within our borders from different nations or born of parents from different nations are also being treated with prejudice, disdain, and grave injustice. During his first term in office, for example, Trump separated refugee children from their families as they crossed our borders. Then he locked them in cages on hard floors with nothing more than aluminum blankets to cover themselves with. Did Americans care? Of course. Many of us were outraged, but not enough. Not enough to prevent this sadist from being reelected. Reelected in part because he saved so many unborn American babies that his voters can finally rest at night atop their soft mattresses beneath their warm quilts, even as many of those children born south of the border still have not been reunited with their parents or their families. We love life. We're lovers of life. We're the pro-life party. Oh, I won't go there. That's another sermon. It's coming. Nor is it only those without documentation, the so-called illegals, who are being targeted. The Trump administration is now sweeping up people who came here legally, including some from our own community, as we all know when we read the news. People who've lived here legally, worked here legally, raised families here legally, and in some cases have been here for decades. For decades. ICE detention numbers have risen nearly 75% since the beginning of 2025, with over 60,000 people currently being held in inadequate detention centers under inhumane circumstances. Nearly 71% of them have no criminal conviction of any kind. Even green card holders, lawful permanent residents, are being taken into custody at airports upon returning from travel, and during routine check-ins, or at courthouses, or in community-level sweeps, often on the basis of old convictions that had never previously triggered any immigration issues. Some have been arrested at their own green card appointments, their final step toward becoming permanent legal residents, including many who are married to American citizens and the primary caretakers of children with special needs. We love life. We love children, and have no criminal history in our country or any other. Even birthright citizenship, as guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, has been challenged and is now under review by the Supreme Court. The message being sent is clear. It does not matter how you came here, how long you've been here, what your legal status is, or how law-abiding you have been. If you were born somewhere else, if you are not an American, or at least not considered an American, your belonging here is always conditional, always revocable, and always subject to the whims of whoever is in power. In recent months, we've had to also sit by and watch as Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth treat the U.S. military like their own personal video game to play whenever they get bored. Who we got to bomb? Let's go bomb Iraq. Let's do it. That'd be a good idea. Right, including blowing up innocent boaters and fishermen in the Caribbean Sea while insisting without any evidence that they're drug smugglers and narco-terrorists. And this has already included more than 20 vessels and the deaths of nearly 100 people. And one incident, as I'm sure you recall, in which an already disabled boat was fired upon and destroyed while a survivor was seen desperately clinging to its side, an action that violates international law and our own code of military conduct. What we have witnessed rather intensely these past few months, although it has been so throughout American history, is the result of an unspoken rule that only American lives matter, and often only the right kind of American lives. I don't see much space between this attitude and that of racism, especially when we use our nationalities as an excuse to hate and harm and exploit and kill those of other nationalities because we feel superior. We're Americans, the greatest country on earth. Doing so may make us patriots, but it does not make us heroic. Nor does it make our nation great. For we can never be great so long as we disregard the welfare and the lives of those from other countries. We cannot achieve our full potential as individuals so long as we confine our relationships and our responsibilities to our nationality rather than to the whole of humanity. And it's okay to love those that we know and to love the way of life that we've grown accustomed to. It's okay to live and to love local. But we can do so without treating those that we don't know like abstractions, or those who live differently like our enemies. When there is a clash between the interest of our nation and the world at large, as Dietrich said, we must recognize the supremacy of the interest of humanity to those of the nation, love and loyalty to the nation, but still greater love and loyalty to humankind. We can never make America great again because for most it was never that great to begin with. But we can make our entire world great for the first time by truly understanding that no matter how much we differ as individuals, we are all members of one human family and therefore deserve to be treated as if our lives matter. Thank you.